In 1993, a young mother living in Jacksonville, Arkansas was found beaten to death. The man convicted of killing her still says to this day he didn't do it.
And that man is Lydell Lee. THV11's Erica Ferrando spoke to families on both sides of this crime.
Joseph Lucky was only a child when his mother, 26-year-old Debra Reese, was allegedly beaten 36 times with a tire tool her husband gave her for protection.
My mother was everything to me.
He spent most of his life hoping for justice and closure.
When she was ripped from my life, it started a spiral that I almost didn't recover from. And my family has lived in the shadow of this event our entire lives.
The man investigators believe to be responsible, Lydell Lee.
Lydell Lee showed no mercy, no lenience to any of the victims that he encountered. He is the embodiment of the evil that should never have to exist in this world.
He's been called a super predator, found guilty of 4 other crimes that include kidnapping, rape, and murder.
It doesn't kill to eat. He kills for fun. He kills for thrill.
All the while, Lydell Lee's younger brother,
I mean, he was a great brother.
knows a very different Lydell Lee.
He's a great brother. I mean, he took me everywhere, taught me how to play basketball.
Kevin Young, while living out of state now, says he keeps in close contact with his brother. I was able to sit down with him when he was in town for an anti-death penalty forum.
He has a heart, you know. I mean, he if you're in need, you know, and you ask him for something, he will give it to you. I mean, he's just that type of guy. You know, he's not what they're portraying he is. He's not. I don't know who they're talking about.
And he stood by his brother, who still claims his innocence. Young says Lee wasn't given a fair trial, and he believes he isn't the man responsible for the crimes he's convicted of.
He's a prayerful guy. We're a praying family, so we've been hoping over the years that, you know, something would break and people would see that he's innocent.
Young says he will fight until the last minute to prove his brother is innocent, while the state prepares to give the family of Debra Reese the closure they were promised. Erica Ferrando, THV11 News.
The witnesses were allowed into the room at around 11 o'clock. At 11:15, the curtain on the death chamber was revealed to see that the process had begun.
A lethal injection was administered at 11:44 p.m. and the coroner pronounced Lydell Lee dead at 11:56 p.m. this 20th day of April.
3 members of the media were allowed into the witness room to watch the execution and make sure that it happened as it was supposed to, along with about a dozen citizen witnesses and 2 lawyers for Lydell Lee. The 3 members of the media said that they watched the execution as it happened. They were seated in the front row, so they couldn't see the witnesses, but they described it as a somber room.
And I didn't hear anyone say anything, frankly. It was very quiet in there and everyone was watching.
A spokesman for Governor Asa Hutchinson came and spoke to the media and gave a brief statement after the executions. He said the governor was in the Capitol while it was all happening and considered it one of his toughest duties to perform as governor.
Just a somber night across Arkansas. We remember the victim and the victim's family. And of course, again, this was something the governor doesn't take lightly, but we are proud of the ADC staff.
Both the attorneys for Lydell Lee and the members of the victim's family chose not to give statements to the media after the execution. A spokesperson for the Department of Corrections said we could have more details from the department later this afternoon. Reporting from outside the Cummins unit in Grady, Arkansas, David Lippman, THV11 News.
Discussing music, watching sitcoms, and making phone calls to his family. Those were the last moments of Lydell Lee's life. He was the first man executed in the state of Arkansas since 2005, and it was his attorney, Lee Short's, first time to witness an execution. Short sat down with THV11's Erica Ferrando.
Representing a man who spent more than 20 years on Arkansas's death row, Lee Short was appointed as Lydell Lee's attorney less than 10 months ago and spent his final hours and minutes by his side.
There were moments where Lydell was pretty nervous. He was pacing. You know, there were moments where he was very sad, where he's talking to his family, saying goodbye to his daughters. telling them to stay strong.
He gave other inmates his few belongings, including a radio, condiments, and
He had a few bags of chips, and he gave those to Stacy Johnson.
And while trying to forget his planned fate, many final moments were spent as two friends talking about music and watching TV.
We watched Don Scott, and it was kind of surreal to watch someone tell you about what's going to occur to yourself. And then after that, we watched 2.5 Men and 2 Broke Girls, and you know, it's surprising that he likes those shows, and we watched them, and it helped us a little bit forget about why we were there.
But after several delays and moments of hope, they were separated.
It's tough to have just been having a conversation with someone about music and TV shows and then see a body bag that you know is meant for them.
And Short, for the first time in his career, watched a man he represented take his final breath.
The hardest part is thinking there's something else you could have done and you wouldn't be where you are right now. And I expressed that to Lydell before they took him away, and he had some reassuring statements that he wouldn't be this close if it weren't for the attorneys that stepped in.
Coming up at 6, Short shares if he plans to ever tackle a case like this again and what impact he thinks these executions will have on the state's future efforts concerning the death penalty.
When you looked at this case, why did you want to take it on?
Well, he needed help. He needed someone local. I think he had called a few people and they weren't available to help. I don't choose my cases based on whether I like the case or I don't like the case. When people need help, that's what I do. I represent people that need help, and so I wasn't going to look into the case first to decide whether he's someone worthy of my help or anything like that.
Had you ever worked on a case like this before?
I've worked on death penalty cases when they're going to trial and things like that. I've never worked on a case at the end of where the execution is close, essentially. So it was a new experience for me.
And so when you talked at his clemency hearing, and then even Lydell Lee has always said he was innocent, you backed him up on that at the clemency hearing. Tell us why.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, I'm an advocate for my client, and I'm their voice. And Ledell Lee, as you stated, has always said that he's innocent, and that's been over 20 years of claiming that he's innocent. I make sure and represent my client and express their voice the way I can, and that's through being an attorney. He doesn't necessarily get to speak at court hearings and things the way that an attorney would, and people don't always take clients as seriously as they would an attorney. So that's my job to represent his view and his opinion and advocate for him.
Tell us a little bit about the Lydell Lee that we don't hear about. What kind of person was he to you?
You know, for the last year, obviously things were pretty serious, and he knew that, so there were times where he was very serious. I'll say that Thursday night, I probably had more intimate conversations with him about what kind of music he likes, which would be reggae, what kind of TV shows he watched. He said honestly he watched PBS more than anything, and you know, what kind of experiences he had with other inmates and guards and things like that. I'll say that he shared some strong feelings towards Damien Eccles. Apparently they spent many, many years with their cells next to each other, so they were able to communicate for many years, and he shared some really heartwarming stories about him and Damien as far as just being there for one another.
What has this experience, not specifically Thursday night, but just the experience of getting to that point, what has that been like for you and Lydell Lee?
Well, I think it's been a stressful one for both of us. It's been one where you know, he's frustrated and somewhat hopeless because he can't affirmatively do anything. He's in solitary confinement. He has access to a phone and letters, but that's about it. He doesn't have access to the courts like an attorney would, and so it's very difficult for him to do anything. And so one of my primary roles was to keep him informed and make sure that he knew that we were out there working for him. And so, you know, sometimes that could get pretty stressful, trying to keep someone's spirits up that's facing an imminent execution.
And so you spent the final hours of his life with him.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about what that was like, and you know, just some of the different things he talked about. I know you mentioned that he mentioned his favorite music and the shows he watched, but what else did he say?
You know, one of the most heart-wrenching things that went on is he called all his family members, and I know there's been question about whether he had family support, and he has a ton of family support. I think he keeps in touch with his family. He kept in touch with them more than I do with my family, and so to have him make those phone calls and be there for that was tough. Also watching him divide his property and give it out to other inmates. Property that you and I probably wouldn't think was very meaningful was very meaningful to him. And one of the most touching things was how hard the Department of Corrections employees that were in there were working to support him through those final hours and make sure that if he needed something, he got it. Make sure and stay positive with him and keep him calm throughout that time. I think it was, you know, one of the things Lydell did is talk about music and TV shows, probably more than anything to help me get through it. He was probably calmer than I was about the whole deal.
What were some of the different things he gave away, and who did he give them to?
You know, first he gave away, he had a few bags of chips, and he gave those to Stacy Johnson, who was in the cell right around the corner, in the quiet cell around the corner. Stacy all through the night was uplifting to Lydell and telling him he'll see him again and it's going to be all right. And so he gave him his chips. He gave his condiments away to his cousin. And he had some other items, I think some saltine crackers that he gave away, and a radio that he was able to give away to another inmate.
I think one thing that was surprising to a lot of people was that he didn't take a last meal, that he chose communion instead. Did he tell you why?
And he never did. I asked him in the days leading up what he was going to choose, just out of curiosity. He didn't tell me. I can only imagine that it's probably pretty difficult to eat because you're taking that meal not the night before, but only hours before the execution. And it may be, you know, sign of some religious reasons, or it may be just that he was extremely nervous and it's hard to eat at that point. He didn't express that to me.
A family and a group of lawyers fighting for answers tonight. It comes 3 years after Ledell Lee, a Jacksonville man, was executed for murder.
He was one of 8 inmates scheduled for execution over 11 days back in 2017 as the state's lethal injection drug supply was expiring. Well, THV11's Jordan Howington went to a press conference this morning, and we learned Lee's family is now requesting DNA testing, I understand, linked to the case.
Yes, Craig. So Lydell Lee's family believes he was wrongfully convicted in the 1993 death of Debra Reese. Police found Reese beaten to death in her home just hours later. Lee was arrested in connection to the murder. Now, from the moment he was arrested until the day he was executed in April 2017, he maintained his innocence, and lawyers now say they found flaws in the evidence used to convict him.
It's never too late for the truth.
A group of lawyers fighting to get closure for Lydell Lee's family.
My brother proclaimed his innocence until his dying breath.
They believe he might have been wrongfully executed in 2017 for the 1993 Jacksonville murder of Debra Reese.
And the state at that time was unable to obtain the killer's DNA profile.
The Innocence Project and the American Civil Liberties Union filed a lawsuit Thursday against Jacksonville PD and the city, asking for DNA evidence like scraping under the victim's fingernails for testing and fingerprint analysis.
We don't know if he is innocent. You know, we don't have scientific tests proving that at this point. What we do have are very serious and scientifically based concerns about his guilt.
These lawyers joined his case just days before his execution. After his death, they turned to their own forensic experts after learning no physical evidence tied Lee to Reese's murder. Court documents state their experts discovered mistakes from state experts at Lee's trial.
Discovered that this fracture to her cheek was not actually caused by a blow to the cheek covered by a rug, as the jury was told. It is clearly a linear pattern from a shoe, and that pattern is incompatible with the soles of Mr. Lee's shoes.
I reached out to Jacksonville City Attorney Stephanie Friedman. She says she's been in contact with Lee's attorney, sharing under state law the city is prevented from releasing DNA physical evidence. And should the city release the evidence, there's a possibility that the evidence would be destroyed.
This is not justice for Lydell Lee or for the people of Arkansas.
Ultimately, lawyers for Lee's family want to know if fingerprints and DNA testing can prove his innocence.
If science can get the truth
get to the truth. We hope the courts will allow the testing so justice can be finally done.
So lawyers have negotiated with the city for 2 years to get this evidence, but they just haven't agreed to that. And that's why they filed the lawsuit today. And Lee's sister requested a hearing before a judge within 7 days. And the Innocent Project has been a part of several high-profile cases using DNA to overturn convictions.
All right, thank you, Jordan.
The family of an Arkansas death row inmate is still fighting to prove his innocence, even years after his execution.
And tonight, THV11's Melissa Zigowitz explores what today's developments could mean for the future of executions in Arkansas.
Back in April 2017, the state of Arkansas attempted something that had never been done before, to execute 8 death row inmates over the course of 11 days. Ultimately, only 4 of them were put to death by lethal injection. The very first one was this man right here, Lydell Lee. But now a new lawsuit claims the state may have killed an innocent man.
Lydell Lee's case has haunted so many people.
It's a case that still has unanswered questions.
It has been proven all throughout this country that innocent people can be convicted of a crime and sent to death row.
Lydell Lee's family and lawyers are asking the city of Jacksonville to hand over DNA evidence from the 1993 murder of Debra Reese.
It hurts no one for the truth to come out.
Veranda Brassfield is a lawyer who followed the case closely in 2017.
The lawsuit that was filed today says that we want the government to be transparent.
Lee was denied DNA testing for evidence like blood found on his shoes.
Lydell Lee, to the day that he died, wanted to test that to exclude the victim and to show that it was the blood from him or an innocent third party.
The family wants Jacksonville to hand over that DNA along with scrapings from under the victim's fingernails.
DNA evidence was not as advanced as it is now.
Brassfield says denying death row inmates DNA testing happens all the time.
And we are denying them a very, it seems simple right. If you're going to kill me, can we just make absolute sure?
If Lee is innocent, this would be the first time in the country someone was proven to be innocent after they've been executed.
If we can execute an innocent man, then that's proof that our system is broken.
This won't change Lydell Lee's fate, but this case could help someone else sitting on death row.
The only thing that could happen here is that the state can prove themselves right, or we can find the right killer and the person that perpetrated this crime. That's a win-win.
In Little Rock, Melissa Zigowitz, THV11 News.
DNA evidence that could potentially prove an executed inmate's innocence will soon be tested by the city of Jacksonville. Thanks so much for joining us tonight at 10. I'm Marlisa Goldsmith.
And I'm Craig O'Neill. THV11's Melissa Zigowitz was there tonight as the city decided to honor a request from the inmate's family.
The mayor tells me this is the right thing to do after Lydell Lee was executed nearly 3 years ago for the 1993 murder of Debra Reese.
Councilmember Sansing.
It was a quick, unanimous decision.
Let the public know.
Jacksonville City Council members agreeing to have physical evidence tested and now executed Lydell Lee's case.
They decided that justice was the right way to go.
Jacksonville Mayor Bob Johnson called the emergency meeting Friday.
My brother proclaimed his innocence until his dying breath.
After Lee's sister, Patricia Young, filed the complaint against the city last week when they refused to hand over the evidence so the family could get it tested themselves.
It's my legal opinion that we can't release physical evidence for public inspection.
City Attorney Stephanie Friedman felt this was a good compromise.
So the difference is we're not handing over the physical evidence, we're only getting it tested, then sharing those results.
It's important to know we either did the right thing or we're going to make it right.
Mayor Johnson wants to be completely transparent.
If there wasn't a question of innocence or guilt, then there wouldn't be need to do this.
Lee was denied DNA testing shortly before he was executed in 2017.
DNA testing has come a long way.
The physical evidence includes scrapings from underneath the victim's fingernails.
You know, I've tried to go, what if this was my relative that would murder? Would I want just anybody put to death, or would I want the murderer brought to justice?
The evidence could be tested as soon as next week.
If we didn't do justice when the conviction happened, then we need to look for justice now.
Mayor Johnson says the city attorney and Lee's family and lawyers will mutually decide where the evidence will be tested.
Did Arkansas put an innocent man to death? That's the question raised by newly tested DNA evidence. And thank you for joining us at 10. I'm Craig O'Neill.
And I'm Marlisa Goldsmith. Ledell Lee maintained his innocence throughout his life up to the day of his execution back in 2017. You'll remember 4 years ago this month, Arkansas attempted something that had never been done before, to execute 8 death row inmates over a span of 11 days to beat the expiration date of one of the drugs in the lethal injection cocktail.
Ultimately, 4 of them were put to death by lethal injection. The first was Ledell Lee. He'd been on death row for 22 years for the murder of 26-year-old Debra Reese in 1993. But as THV11's Ashley Godwin shows us, new test results may cast doubt on his guilt.
New evidence shows that Lydell Lee may not have been the only person there at the time of Debra Reese's death. In fact, attorneys say that there was no physical evidence that connected Lee to her murder.
4 years after Lydell Lee's execution, new evidence requested by the Innocence Project and ACLU shows Lee's DNA was not on the wooden club or a bloody shirt found at the crime scene. According to the test results, DNA of an unknown male was found.
I immediately thought that this is something that we needed to determine and establish before we executed him back in 2017.
Ferronda Brassfield, a local attorney who followed the case closely, protested against Lee's execution for lack of definitive proof.
When we begged the Attorney General not to set these dates or not to ask the governor for these dates to be set, not only the state of Arkansas, but any state, before you're going to execute someone, that you examine all of the evidence carefully, and especially DNA evidence, because we know now that DNA evidence can be compelling and it can be definitive to say one way or the other.
In a statement given to THV11, Attorney General Leslie Rutledge said the courts consistently rejected Ledell Lee's frivolous claims because the evidence demonstrated beyond any shadow of a doubt that he murdered Debra Reese by beating her to death inside her home with a tire thumper. After 20 years, I am prayerful that Debra's family has had closure following his lawful execution in 2017.
My heart goes out to all of the folks that are involved in this case, the victim's family, for Lydell Lee's family. I can only imagine what they're going through. They begged and pleaded to have this DNA evidence examined before their loved one was executed by the state of Arkansas.
In Little Rock, Ashley Godwin, THV11 News.
New this morning, Governor Hutchinson has now commented on recently revealed DNA evidence found in the case of executed Arkansas inmate Ledell Lee.
You may remember the governor set the execution date 4 years ago. Well, in January of 2020, the Innocence Project and ACLU asked for new DNA testing in Lee's case. And last week, the testing came back. And it showed Lee's DNA was not on the wooden club that reportedly was used to murder Debra Reese, nor was it on the bloody shirt found at the scene. Instead, there was an unknown male's DNA found on both of those items.
So yesterday, the governor was asked about his reaction to those new findings.
Whenever you make tough decisions, whenever you have to carry out the decision of a jury, you realize that it's been reviewed by the Supreme Court at every level. They affirm the convictions, and it's my duty to carry out the law. The evidence, obviously, that was uncovered is inconclusive, and the fact is that the jury found him guilty based upon the information that they had.
The testing did find moderate support that blood found on Lee's left shoe could belong to Debra Reese. As for the unknown male's DNA, there have been no potential matches found in the national DNA database.